For 600 bloody years, one empire stood at the center of the world and fought war after war. They fought against the kings of Europe, the czars of Russia, the shahs of Persia, and the crusaders of Christendom. They conquered nations, lost nations, redrew the maps of 3 continents, and kept a massive army marching from the gates of Vienna, in the frozen north to the burning sands of the Arabian desert. And through it all, through the plagues, the rebellions, and the endless sieges, they managed to pull off a financial magic trick that almost no other empire in history could replicate. They didn't go bankrupt doing it. While the Spanish Empire drowned in debt despite fleets full of stolen gold, and the French monarchy collapsed under the weight of its own military spending, the Ottoman Empire kept the machine running because the Ottomans didn't just fight war. They found a way to finance war endlessly. Welcome to The Economic Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Ottoman Empire lasted from around 1299 to 1922, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the British Empire, and longer than almost any state the modern world talks about. But longevity is not the mystery here. The mystery is solvency. How did a state that was in a perpetual state of conflict for 6 centuries not collapse under the crushing financial pressure of its own ambition? Western viewers often imagine that empires fall because they lose battles, but that is a lie. Battles don't bankrupt nations. Budgets do. Logistics do. Payrolls do. The Ottoman Empire learned this lesson early. And instead of building a conventional tax-on-spend system like the clumsy kingdoms of Europe, they engineered something far more efficient. They built a machine where war could pay for itself. But before we deconstruct the mechanism, we need to establish what the Ottomans actually were, because for many Western audiences, the empire is a vague cinematic idea of turbans, domes, and scimitars. The reality was much more cold and calculated. The Ottomans began as a small frontier principality in northwest Anatolia, led by Osman I, a warlord with a few thousand riders and a talent for being in the right place at the right time. When the Byzantine Empire began to crumble and Mongol power receded from the Near East, Osman's followers were perfectly positioned to carve out new territory. But their early victories weren't just military successes. They were financial mergers. Every conquest meant land. Every conquest meant resources. Every conquest meant new populations to extract revenue from. And that is the first key to understanding the Ottoman financial system. From day one, warfare wasn't a cost, it was an income stream. By the time the Ottomans captured Bursa in 1326 and later crossed into Europe in the 1350s, they were no longer a frontier tribe. They were the rising power controlling the most valuable real estate on Earth, the trade routes between Europe and Asia. In medieval economics, this is like having a monopoly on the world's arteries. Every merchant who traveled from Venice to Persia, from Cairo to Budapest, from Baghdad to Istanbul, passed through the Ottoman toll gate. This mattered because war requires 3 things: food, metal, and men. The Ottomans didn't necessarily have more of any of these than their neighbors, but they had something even more important: cash flow. Their empire was built on the richest crossroads of the pre-modern world. Silk from China, spices from India, carpets from Persia, timber from the Balkans, sugar from Egypt, copper from Anatolia. Everything moved through their territory. And every time something moved, the Sultan took his cut. But a strong revenue base alone doesn't explain how the empire paid for centuries of campaigns. Because almost every empire in history has had revenue, and most still collapsed under the weight of military costs. What made the Ottomans different was structural. They designed a financial system that turned the army into a self-financing institution. This is where the story shifts from geography to design to one of the most important and misunderstood innovations in Ottoman history, the Timar System. Imagine a government trying to avoid the biggest cost of all: payroll. Modern states spend fortunes on professional soldiers. Salaries, equipment, horses, pensions, healthcare. Militaries drain budgets faster than any other sector. The Ottomans solved this problem by refusing to pay their cavalry in cash. Instead, they paid them in rights. A timar was essentially a tax district, a grant of land revenue. A soldier, usually a cavalryman called a sipahi, received the right to collect taxes from a specific village or region directly. In exchange, he was obligated to equip himself, maintain his horse, feed his retainers, and show up for campaigns with proper armor and weapons. He didn't receive a salary from the central treasury. He funded himself from the land he protected. It was one of the most ingenious pieces of financial engineering in world history. The state reduced its administrative expenses because it didn't need thousands of tax collectors. The soldier became invested in local stability because if the peasants didn't produce, he didn't get paid. And the empire had a massive cavalry army that could mobilize quickly without emptying the treasury vault. Imagine if today's government paid a soldier not with money, but with the right to collect taxes from a specific neighborhood. If that sounds dangerous, you're right, but in the 1400s, it worked spectacularly well. It turned the Ottoman army into a tax-powered military machine. And it did something even more important. It meant that Ottoman warfare was cheap. Europe at the time relied on expensive knights or unreliable mercenaries who demanded payment up front in gold. If a European king ran out of money, his army ran out of loyalty. The Ottomans didn't have that problem. Their soldiers' funding flowed from the harvest, even during peacetime. War didn't strain the budget. It activated the system. But the Timar System wasn't the only mechanism that allowed the Ottomans to fund 6 centuries of conflict. They had another innovation, one that Western audiences often know by name, but rarely understand fully from an economic perspective: the Janissaries. And their funding model was a core part of the Ottoman financial engine. But that story requires a shift, from cavalry funded by taxes to infantry funded by something far more controversial. To understand the second piece of the Ottoman war financing engine, we need to look at the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that foreigners feared. Christians resented and sultans trusted more than their own families. They were professional soldiers, disciplined, trained from youth, and loyal to the state alone. In European terms, they were the closest thing the Middle Ages had to Marines. But what made them financially unique was how the empire acquired and funded them. The Janissaries came from the Devshirme, often called the child levy. In Christian villages across the Balkans, boys were selected, removed from their homes, converted to Islam, and educated in the empire's military schools. They were trained, indoctrinated, and molded into a class of soldiers who owed everything to the state, not to tribes, not to landlords, not to regions. Now, the ethics of this system are brutal and we shouldn't romanticize it. But financially, it accomplished something no other empire managed. The state acquired elite soldiers without paying the high upfront market cost of recruiting men. The empire invested heavily in Janissary education, but the initial economic burden of raising children to adulthood was effectively outsourced to the conquered populations. This meant the Ottoman Empire obtained fully formed soldiers without the lifetime expenses that would bankrupt a treasury. And once these soldiers entered service, they were paid and housed. But they were also prohibited from marrying or owning businesses in their early centuries, which prevented conflicts of interest and kept the state in control. If the Timar System turned the cavalry into a self-financing force, the Janissaries turned the infantry into a highly efficient, cost-controlled professional corps. Combined, they formed a military system that saved the empire untold amounts of money over the centuries. But the Ottomans didn't stop there. They perfected something even more powerful, ensuring that war paid for war. Whenever the empire conquered new territory, it didn't just gain land, it gained the ghanima, the spoils of war. But more importantly, it gained new taxpayers, new timars, to grant to new soldiers, new trade routes, new ports, and new revenue streams. Every conquest strengthened the financial foundation of the next campaign. A European kingdom might win a war and come home poorer due to debt. The Ottomans often came home richer. This is the heart of their long-term survival strategy. It wasn't just religious zeal or military strategy, it was cash flow. Consider the geography again. The Ottoman Empire straddled the Bosporus, the Dardanelles, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the caravan routes to Persia and Central Asia. If you wanted to move goods from Europe to Asia, or vice versa, you paid the Ottomans. Venetian merchants, Arab traders, Balkan caravans, North African fleets, they all passed through the empire's toll booth. This system worked so well that by the 1500s, under Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire had become one of the wealthiest states on earth. War was expensive, but trade was more profitable. And the empire built financial systems to tap into that profit directly. One was state monopolies. Certain strategic commodities, salt, tobacco, coffee, copper, sometimes soap, were controlled directly by the state. These goods were essential for daily life, which meant the money flowed predictably into the treasury, regardless of the economy's performance. This is where the story starts sounding eerily modern, because state monopolies are the ancestors of today's strategic national industries. Think oil in Saudi Arabia. Think gas pipelines in Russia. Think the Suez Canal in Egypt. Every empire has a revenue anchor. For the Ottomans, these monopolies were the closest thing they had to a perpetual income machine. Another financial strategy was the use of tribute in vassal states. Many regions, from the Crimea in the north to Wallachia in the west, paid annual sums to the Ottoman treasury in exchange for protection or autonomy. It was cheaper to accept tribute than to govern directly, and the income funded soldiers, roads, fortresses, and fleets without the administrative headache of bureaucracy. But the real brilliance and eventual weakness of the Ottoman financial system was how it delayed the need for borrowing. For centuries, the empire lived within its means. War was financed by land grants, trade tolls, tribute, plunder, and monopolies. There was no national debt spiral, no giant bond market draining the treasury, no foreign lenders deciding the empire's fate. But that didn't last forever. By the late 1600s and 1700s, the world changed. The discovery of the Americas flooded the world with silver, causing massive inflation known as the price revolution, which devalued the Ottoman currency. European powers industrialized. Their armies adopted new technologies that were expensive to maintain. Their trade routes shifted across the Atlantic and around Africa, bypassing the Ottoman land routes. Suddenly, the toll booth was empty. The cash flow dried up. Worse, the Timar System began decaying. Local tax holders abused their power, treating public land as private property. Centralized oversight weakened, and the cavalry became less reliable. Then came the Janissaries. Over the centuries, they gained political influence, wealth, and privileges, until they became a state within a state. Their financial independence and political clout made them impossible to control. They resisted reforms, drained the treasury with demands for bonuses, and eventually became one of the biggest obstacles to modernization. When the empire finally realized it needed to change, when it tried to adopt European-style armies and modern bureaucracy, it needed something it had avoided for centuries: liquid cash. To fund that, the Ottomans made the fatal mistake. They turned to the bankers of Galata, and eventually to the banks of London and Paris. In the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire began borrowing heavily from European banks at high interest rates to fund its modernization and its wars. The same European powers it once outplayed now held its mortgage. The debt spiraled out of control. The interest payments became larger than the empire's entire tax revenue. In 1875, the empire declared bankruptcy. By 1881, the humiliation was complete. The empire was forced to create the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an organization run by European creditors that took control of Ottoman tax revenues. Foreigners were now collecting taxes inside the empire to pay themselves back. It was a loss of sovereignty more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The empire didn't die on the battlefield, it died in a bank ledger. It's a familiar pattern, isn't it? Great power rises on financial discipline, holds itself together with innovative systems, ignores early warning signs, and collapses when the economics stop working. Which brings us to today. If you think the Ottoman system sounds ancient, look around. The same mechanisms still exist, just wearing modern clothes. The old Timar system functions today as the military-industrial complex. Modern states outsource enormous parts of their military logistics, intelligence, and even combat operations to private contractors. Reducing direct payroll burdens the same way the Ottomans once did, trade tolls have become the modern struggle for control over shipping lanes and energy routes. From the Strait of Hormuz to the South China Sea, whoever controls a choke point controls the revenue that passes through it. State monopolies live on through national oil companies and sovereign wealth funds. Saudi Aramco plays the same role the Ottoman salt monopoly once did, just on a scale of trillions instead of millions. Conquest paying for conquest still exists in the form of resource-driven wars. Countries pursue territory or influence, not for glory, but for energy reserves, rare earth minerals, pipelines, and strategic geography. And late borrowing, the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, echoes today in modern national debt crises. Many states fund their deficits with loans until the system cracks. From the debt crises of Argentina and Greece to the looming debt ceiling debates in the United States, the financial logic of empire doesn't change, the uniforms do. So what is the lesson? Empires don't die when they lose a war. They die when they can no longer afford the peace. The Ottomans survived 6 centuries because their financial system was disciplined, efficient, and brilliantly designed to turn war into revenue. They collapsed when that system broke, when expansion stopped paying for itself, when trade routes bypassed their territory, when soldiers became expensive, and when the empire borrowed so much money that foreign creditors owned its future. And that's the deeper warning beneath their story. Financial systems can sustain power for centuries until the day they can't. History is a ledger, and the debt always comes due. The Economic Historian. Subscribe and learn to read the fine print.